The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant Major William Thompson adjusted his red tunic for what he knew would be the last time. At 62, his weathered hands still moved with the precision that had earned him respect among the Queen's Guard for over 4 decades. The brass buttons gleamed like tiny suns against the crimson fabric, each one polished to perfection despite the tremor that had recently begun to plague his fingers. Thompson had served through 3 monarchs, witnessed history unfold from his post, and had never once faltered in his duty. But today was different. The doctors had been clear about his condition. Early onset, Parkinson's disease would soon make it impossible for him to maintain the rigid standards expected of the Guard. His retirement ceremony was scheduled for the following week, a quiet affair befitting a man who had always preferred service over recognition. As he walked through the familiar corridors, Thompson's mind drifted to the countless young royals he had watched grow up within these walls. Princess Anne's determined spirit, Prince William's quiet strength, and most recently the newest generation that brought such joy to the ancient stones. Among them all, Prince George held a special place in the old Guard's heart, though protocol had never allowed him to show it. The 10-year-old prince possessed an unusual quality for someone so young. He noticed things others missed. While his siblings might rush past the guards as if they were merely part of the furniture, George would sometimes pause, offering a small nod or a barely perceptible smile. These moments, brief as they were, had created an unspoken bond between the aging soldier and the future king. Thompson had first noticed this quality 3 years earlier, when Prince George, then just 7, had dropped his toy soldier near the guard post. Instead of calling for his nanny, the young prince had carefully picked it up himself, glancing at Thompson's perfectly still form before whispering a soft, "Thank you," to the air. The sergeant major's training prevented any response, but something stirred within him that day, a recognition that this child understood respect in a way that couldn't be taught. Now, as Thompson prepared for his final day of service, he wondered if Prince George had somehow sensed the significance of recent events. The boy had been visiting his great-grandmother more frequently, and Thompson had observed him during these visits. There was a thoughtfulness to George's movements, a careful attention to the people around him that spoke of wisdom beyond his years. The morning briefing concluded with the usual reminders about protocol and positioning. Thompson's replacement, a capable young man named Davies, listened intently to every instruction. The torch was being passed to capable hands, but Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen on this, his final day of active duty. As the guards took their positions, Thompson felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle upon his shoulders. The tourists would come. The routine would unfold as it had thousands of times before, but today carried an air of finality that made every moment more precious. Little did he know that Prince George had been planning something that would transform this ordinary day into an extraordinary memory that would be cherished for years to come. Prince George sat at his desk in the palace schoolroom, but his mind wasn't on mathematics or geography. Through the tall windows he could see the familiar figure of Sergeant Major Thompson, standing at his post, as motionless as a statue despite the gentle breeze that stirred the leaves in the courtyard. The boy had overheard his father speaking quietly with his mother about Thompson's retirement, and though the adults thought children weren't listening, George had absorbed every word. The previous evening, while the family gathered for dinner, Prince William had mentioned how Thompson had served with distinction for over 40 years. "He's been part of this place longer than most of us have been alive," his father had said, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. "Men like him are the backbone of everything we represent." George had excused himself early from dinner, claiming tiredness, but sleep had been elusive. Instead, he lay in bed thinking about all the times he had seen Thompson at his post, during state visits when the guard stood for hours without moving, during rainy days when water dripped from his bearskin cap, and during the hottest summer afternoons when other guards might show signs of discomfort. But Thompson remained steadfast. The young prince had begun to understand something that many adults missed about duty and service. It wasn't just about following rules or maintaining traditions. It was about caring so deeply for something larger than yourself that personal comfort became irrelevant. Thompson embodied this principle in a way that made George want to be better, to live up to the example set by this quiet guardian. As his tutor droned on about fractions, George's mind formulated a plan. He thought about the military history books he'd been reading, about the traditions his great-grandmother had shared with him during their private conversations, and about the power of gestures that came from the heart rather than obligation. He knew that what he was considering would break protocol, but sometimes the most important actions were those that honored the spirit of tradition rather than just its letter. During the lunch break, George approached his private secretary with a request that raised eyebrows but couldn't be denied. He wanted to visit his great-grandmother that afternoon, and he had something specific he needed to discuss with her. The meeting was arranged, though the adults around him exchanged curious glances about the sudden urgency in the young prince's request. Queen Elizabeth II received her great-grandson in her private sitting room, a space filled with photographs spanning decades of service and family memories. George had always felt comfortable in this room, surrounded by the tangible evidence of duty fulfilled and love shared. Today, however, he approached his great-grandmother with an unusual formality that caught her attention immediately. "Great-grandmother," George began, his young voice carrying a weight that made the Queen set aside her papers and give him her full attention. "I need to ask you about something important. It's about Sergeant Major Thompson." The Queen's eyes sparkled with interest. She had noticed George's growing awareness of the people who served their family, and she wondered what had prompted this particular conversation. As her great-grandson explained his observations and his growing plan, she found herself both surprised and profoundly moved by the depth of his understanding. "What you're suggesting would be quite unprecedented," she told him gently, but there was approval in her voice. However, sometimes the most meaningful gestures are those that come from genuine respect and gratitude. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, with George asking detailed questions about military traditions, the proper way to acknowledge service, and the difference between formal recognition and personal tribute. By the time he left his great-grandmother's sitting room, both of them knew that the following day would be unlike any other in the sergeant major's long and distinguished career. The next morning brought an unusual flurry of activity to the palace. Thompson noticed it immediately as he took his position for what he knew would be his final day of active duty. Staff members moved with a purposefulness that suggested something significant was planned, though no one had informed the guards of any special events or visiting dignitaries. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had spent the early morning helping George prepare for what he had decided to do. She had initially been concerned about her son's plan, worried about the precedent it might set or the attention it might draw. However, after speaking with Prince William and seeing the genuine emotion behind George's request, she had become his strongest supporter. "Remember," she told her eldest son as she straightened his tie, "this is about showing respect and gratitude. It's not about breaking rules for the sake of it, but about honoring someone who has given his life to serving our family." George nodded solemnly. He had spent the previous evening reading about military honors and traditions, wanting to ensure that whatever he did would be meaningful rather than merely symbolic. His great-grandmother had shared stories about the guards who had served during her reign, helping him understand that behind every motionless figure in red stood a person with hopes, fears, and a dedication that deserved recognition. Prince William found himself both nervous and proud as he watched his son prepare. At 10 years old, George was showing an understanding of leadership that went beyond his years. The decision to acknowledge Thompson's service hadn't come from adult suggestion or protocol requirements. It had emerged from the boy's own sense of what was right and proper. As the morning progressed, Thompson maintained his position despite the growing sense that something unusual was about to occur. His trained eye caught the subtle changes in routine, staff members positioning themselves at various windows, the unusual number of senior household members present in areas where they typically didn't linger, and most tellingly, the presence of the royal family's photographer in the courtyard. The sergeant major had developed an ability over 4 decades to sense significant moments before they fully revealed themselves. State occasions had their own energy, emergencies created a different kind of tension, and personal moments within the royal family generated yet another atmosphere entirely. Today felt like something unprecedented, a convergence of formality and intimacy that he couldn't quite place. Young Davies, Thompson's replacement, stood nearby learning the final details of his new position. The young guard had been briefed extensively, But Thompson knew that real understanding would only come through experience. As they stood together, Thompson found himself hoping that Davies would have the privilege of witnessing the same growth and development in the royal children that he had been fortunate enough to observe. The morning tourists began to gather, cameras ready to capture the traditional changing of the guard ceremony. They had no idea that they were about to witness something far more meaningful than the usual display of military precision. Among the crowd, palace staff members had discreetly positioned themselves to ensure that whatever was about to unfold would be properly documented and protected from any disruption. Thompson felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same sensation he had experienced before moments of historical significance throughout his career. He had stood at attention during jubilees and state funerals, had maintained his post during moments of national celebration and mourning, and had always taken pride in being present for events that would be remembered long after his service ended. As the clock approached the appointed hour for the changing of the guard, Thompson saw Prince George emerge from the palace accompanied by his father. The young prince walked with a purposefulness that immediately caught the sergeant major's attention. This wasn't the casual movement of a child going about his daily routine. This was the measured approach of someone with a specific and important mission to accomplish. Prince George walked across the courtyard with his father beside him, his small hands clasped behind his back in unconscious imitation of military bearing. The young prince had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, but now that it was actually happening, he felt the weight of its significance more deeply than he had anticipated. The tourists fell silent as they recognized the royal figures, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Thompson remained rigidly at attention, his eyes fixed straight ahead according to protocol, but his peripheral vision caught every detail of Prince George's approach. The boy moved with a gravity that seemed impossible for someone so young, yet entirely natural given the circumstances. This wasn't a child playing at being grown up. This was a future king learning what it meant to honor those who served. As George reached the position directly in front of Thompson, he stopped and stood perfectly still for a moment that stretched longer than seemed natural. The courtyard, usually filled with the chatter of tourists and the ambient sounds of the city beyond the palace walls, fell into an almost sacred quiet. Even the pigeons seemed to pause their constant movement, as if nature itself recognized the significance of what was about to happen. Then, with movements that had clearly been practiced but retained their spontaneous sincerity, Prince George raised his right hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute. The gesture was precise and respectful, executed with the kind of attention to detail that would have made any drill sergeant proud. But more than its technical accuracy, the salute carried an emotional weight that transformed the entire courtyard into something resembling a chapel. For Thompson, this moment shattered decades of training in the most beautiful way possible. Protocol demanded that he remain motionless, that he treat this like any other interaction during his guard duty. But protocol had never anticipated a gesture of such pure recognition and gratitude from a member of the royal family he had spent his life protecting. The sergeant major felt something crack inside his chest. Not his discipline, which remained intact, but the careful emotional barriers he had constructed to maintain professional distance. Prince William stood slightly behind his son, his own emotions carefully controlled but clearly moved by what he was witnessing. This had been George's idea entirely, planned and executed with a maturity that reminded the prince of his own childhood, moments of sudden understanding about duty and service. Watching his son honor Thompson's lifetime of dedication, William felt a profound pride in the man George was becoming. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Prince George held his salute with unwavering precision, his young face serious and respectful. Around the courtyard, staff members and tourists alike seemed frozen in recognition of witnessing something genuinely meaningful. Cameras captured the moment, but the real impact was felt rather than seen. The acknowledgement of one person's worth by another, the bridge built between generations through simple human recognition. Thompson's throat tightened as he realized what this gesture represented. It wasn't just a thank you for his service, though it certainly was that. It was recognition that he had been seen, truly seen by the boy he had watched grow up from a distance. All those years of standing at attention, of being present but invisible, of serving without expectation of acknowledgement, had culminated in this moment of pure appreciation. The young prince finally lowered his salute, but he didn't immediately walk away. Instead, he took a small step closer to Thompson and spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried clearly in the still air. "Thank you for everything, Sergeant Major Thompson. Your service has meant more than you know." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Thompson felt 43 years of service validated in that single sentence, spoken by a child who understood that true leadership begins with gratitude for those who make everything else possible. The sergeant major's eyes, which had remained dry through countless ceremonies and farewells, suddenly felt the sting of tears he couldn't quite suppress. The moment seemed suspended in time, with Prince George's words echoing in the quiet courtyard while Thompson fought to maintain his composure. Years of military training warred with human emotion as the sergeant major processed what had just occurred. No protocol manual had ever covered this situation. What did a guard do when personally addressed by a member of the royal family during duty hours, especially when that address came with such heartfelt gratitude? Prince William stepped forward then, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder while addressing Thompson directly. "Sergeant Major, my family and I have been aware of your exemplary service for many years. Your dedication has been an example to all of us, and we wanted to ensure that your final day of active duty was marked with the recognition you deserve." Thompson's military bearing finally began to crack as the full impact of the situation settled upon him. This wasn't a spontaneous gesture by a child who didn't understand protocol. This was a planned acknowledgement that had clearly been approved at the highest levels. The presence of other family members now visible at various palace windows confirmed that this moment had been orchestrated with care and deliberate intent. The sergeant major's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the slight tremor that betrayed his emotions despite his best efforts to maintain professional composure. "Your Royal Highness, it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve the crown and your family. I never imagined." "That's exactly why this recognition is so important," Prince George interjected with a wisdom that seemed to surprise even himself. "The best people often don't expect to be thanked, which means they should be thanked the most." The tourists gathered in the courtyard began to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. Phones and cameras captured the scene, but many simply stood in respectful silence, instinctively understanding that they were present for a moment of genuine human connection that transcended the usual pageantry of royal life. This wasn't performance or ceremony. This was authentic gratitude being expressed between real people. Catherine appeared at one of the palace windows, her own emotions clearly affected as she watched her eldest son demonstrate the kind of leadership that couldn't be taught in any classroom. The lesson George was learning today, that true power is expressed through appreciation of others, would serve him well throughout his life and eventual reign. Thompson felt compelled to respond to Prince George's remarkable statement, his military bearing softening into something more personal. "Your Royal Highness, if I may say so, your understanding of these matters at such a young age gives me great confidence in the future of the crown. It has been a privilege to watch you grow, even from a distance." The admission that he had indeed been watching, that the guards were not merely decorative fixtures but human beings who cared about the family they protected, seemed to delight Prince George. The boy's face lit up with the realization that his own observations of the guards had been mutual, that there had been a silent relationship developing over the years through shared presence and unspoken respect. Prince William observed this exchange with growing appreciation for what his son had initiated. The formal distance between the royal family and their security personnel was necessary for many reasons, but moments like this reminded everyone involved that they were all human beings connected by shared purpose and mutual care. As other guards began to arrive for the changing of the guard ceremony, Thompson realized that his extraordinary final day was about to transition into the formal conclusion of his career. But now, instead of ending with standard protocol and administrative efficiency, his service would conclude with the knowledge that he had been truly seen and deeply appreciated by the future King of England. The changing of the guard ceremony proceeded with its traditional precision, but everyone present knew they had witnessed something far more significant than military routine. As Thompson prepared to hand over his responsibilities to Davies, the weight of transition felt different than he had expected. Instead of ending with emptiness, his career was concluding with a fullness that would sustain him for the rest of his life. Davies stepped forward to receive his final briefing, and Thompson found himself speaking not just about procedures and protocols, but about the deeper meaning of their service. "Remember," he told the young guard quietly, "we're not just protecting buildings or following routines. We're guardians of something larger: tradition, stability, and most importantly, people who have dedicated their lives to serving others." Prince George remained in the courtyard longer than usual, seemingly reluctant to let this extraordinary morning end. He watched as Thompson began the process of officially transferring his duties, understanding that he was witnessing the end of an era. The boy had begun to comprehend that every ending was also a beginning, and that his own gesture of recognition had transformed what could have been a melancholy farewell into something celebratory. As the formal ceremony concluded, Thompson found himself approaching Prince George one final time. The protocol books would never approve, but some moments transcended written rules in favor of human decency. The sergeant major came to attention and offered his own salute to the young prince, a gesture that acknowledged not just royal rank, but the character and wisdom George had displayed. "I will carry the memory of this day with me always." "Your Royal Highness," Thompson said, his voice steady now with the peace that comes from completion. "You've taught an old soldier that service is most meaningful when it's truly appreciated." Prince George returned the salute with the same precision he had shown earlier, but now there was something additional in his expression: the satisfaction that comes from doing something important and doing it well. "I hope I can serve as well as you have, Sergeant Major Thompson." The exchange concluded with handshakes between Thompson and the other family members present. Prince William expressed the family's gratitude more formally, but the essence of the moment had already been captured in his son's spontaneous recognition of worth and service. Catherine offered her own thanks, noting that George's actions had reminded everyone present about the importance of acknowledging those who serve others. As Thompson walked away from his post for the final time, he turned for one last look at the palace that had been his second home for over 4 decades. Prince George was still visible in the courtyard, now playing with his siblings but occasionally glancing toward the guard post where Davies stood at attention. The cycle of service continued, but it had been enriched by a moment of genuine human connection. In the days that followed, the story of Prince George's salute spread throughout the palace staff and beyond. It became a reminder that true leadership involves recognizing the contributions of others, that protocol serves people rather than the reverse, and that sometimes the most powerful gestures are the simplest ones. The young prince had learned something invaluable about command, that those who truly lead do so by first understanding and appreciating those they will one day be responsible. For Thompson's retirement ceremony the following week was a more elaborate affair than originally planned, attended by senior members of the royal family, and conducted with the full honors his service deserved. But everyone present knew that the real recognition had already taken place in a quiet courtyard, when a 10-year-old boy had the wisdom and courage to thank a man who had spent his life standing guard. The sergeant major's final salute had indeed come after Prince George's silent but profound choice, the choice to see, to acknowledge, and to honor service with the gratitude it deserved.